Hey, what's up everybody? It's a Motley GM here with you once again. And before I get started with my topic today, I'm recording this July 2nd, 2024, and we are in Independent TTRPG month. And that is what the channel is all about. So let me start the video by just showing you a few books here that you can go to drivethroughrpg.com and check out for yourself. All independent, all pretty awesome from my reading through and or experience with them. So please go support independent games. Again, my channel is all about this. Check out my video series on my plea for you to play other tabletop games if you want to see some other independent games that I really love. No further ado, go check out the Mecha Hack if you're into mechs and that type of gameplay. For you pirate fans out there, the Motley GM does recommend Yar. Check that out. Sharp Sword Sinister Spells, a really awesome rules light game that I just think is kind of clever and gets overlooked a little bit. And Never Going Home for a completely different atmosphere and just I love the idea behind this game. I want you guys to go check it out. Great community behind this game too. All right. Check out those games, everybody. Independent RPGs in the tabletop space is something that this channel was created specifically for. I'm very much for the independent games, and the variety that's out there now is wonderful, if not a bit overwhelming. So I encourage you, check out more games, find the ones that you like, and play those the most. But don't be afraid to experience some other stuff. That being said, thank you for joining me once again in my second video of what I like to call a genre chat, or where we talk a little bit about a genre and I give you a little bit of background on it and hopefully maybe a little inspiration. This video was actually inspired by a Facebook post that I saw where Seth Gorkowski did a really good job of explaining to somebody what sword and sorcery is. And that inspired me to want to kind of delve into the fantasy realm a little bit, explain to you how I see it and some of the more popular subgenres of what we consider fantasy, at least here in America and in Western culture. What I'm talking about today mostly is what I like to call classic medieval inspired fantasy. And I use medieval here not necessarily as a term of a specific time period, but more as an ambiguous idea of a past before the Industrial Revolution, before modern times, basically. Now, in fantasy books and fantasy games, there's often weapons and political systems that come from different parts of history existing in the same spot. So just accept that going in, and that's kind of what I'm accepting here. So in this video, we're excluding settings that are specifically alternate reality that tries to stick as close to a historical period as possible. We're going to exclude games like that for this video at least. A big shout out to Seth Gorkowski for not only being one of the inspirations for the channel, but for that Facebook interaction that you wrote that inspired this video. So I hope I'm not saying anything that sounds like I am taking from somebody else, but let's face it, some ideas we just all share in common. So if any of those overlap, Seth, I love you. I think you're great. Keep doing what you do. Please, you are such a better creator than I could ever possibly want to be. That being said, let's take a look at fantasy and what I would consider some of the main subgenres that I often see in tabletop games. And when I do so, I'll give you some examples of places you might be able to find inspiration or examples of what I'm talking about. From my understanding, what we call fantasy in America and Western culture originates from old tales, folklores, myths, legends, all the ancient stories that were passed down orally. This is the inspiration for a lot of what we consider fantasy today. Every culture has some kind of folklore, but at least from an American perspective, again, most of the tabletop games that we know, and of course the originating one that we don't really mention on this channel much, are based mostly on Eurocentric ideas. These are the inspirations for what's called traditional fantasy, or what I'm going to talk about here next in just a minute. And then from that traditional fantasy comes the modern fantasy that we kind of delve a little bit more into now in games that wasn't necessarily as popular or even inspiring to the originators of our tabletop game community. Now, with traditional fantasy, we're talking the stories, books, movies, or whatnot that almost everybody thinks of right away when we're talking about fantasy. Your Lords of the Rings, your Chronicles of Narnias, your Last Unicorns, many familiar fairy tales and folklores. This can be regional, but many of them resonate throughout large bits of cultures, and they've been inspirations for many, many things that came after it, of course. These traditional fantasies, or at least what I'm calling traditional fantasy here, I might not be 100% on the mark, but what I'm calling traditional fantasy has inspired the modern fantasy that we see more of today. I have some subgenres here that I am going to talk about that hopefully will clarify it up a little bit and help some people kind of hone in on what it is they actually want to play or what sounds the most interesting to them if you're going to play in the classic fantasy genre of games. There are 3 subgenres that I personally feel, at least from my experience and what I've seen, are the typical subgenres of fantasy that you'll find in tabletop RPGs. Now, as I go through these, I'm going to do my best to give 3 examples of books and or other media, 3 examples that are specifically movies, and then 3 games that I feel capture the feel of these subgenres from my opinion. Most of these things are things I've experienced myself by listening, reading, or playing. In the cases where that wasn't the case, I used what was the most popular from that genre. Let's start off with grimdark or low fantasy. Grimdark is a very popular fantasy subgenre, and I feel it's what the majority of the OSR is really all about, that grimdark fantasy. However, there's other examples out there that are a little bit outside the OSR space. I'm looking at Warhammer role-playing, fantasy role-playing in this case, and other games similar to that. What grimdark really is taking those traditional fantasy tropes, they're adding some elements of horror, and come up with a much more bleak and violent world with an amoral tone to it. Magic in this subgenre is typically considered dark and evil. The characters aren't really looked at as heroes per se in this particular genre, and may even be looked down upon and not accepted by normal society. That kind of encompasses the basis of what grimdark is from my understanding. You want to check out some books about it, or things that are in multiple media actually. Game of Thrones is a good example of grimdark. The Black Company is a book that really, I think, does that, and the Broken Empire series. As far as movies go, look to Armies of Darkness, The Black Cauldron, and Solomon Kane for some movies that give you that grimdark feel. There's many more than I'm giving you here. I'm just giving you 3 to start with. Feel free to go and check out all the stuff that you like that's related to the stuff I'm giving you here. Some games I think that really capture that grimdark feel. Knave, which just came out with a 2nd edition, which is awesome, by the way. Cairn, one of my absolute favorite rules-like game ever created. Deathbringer, that is Professor Dungeon Master's game over from Dungeon Craft. Absolutely made to be grimdark, and he totally admits that. And Morkborg, and sorry PDM, I can't pronounce that the way you do, so I'm just saying Morkborg like everybody else does. These are all great examples of a grimdark, low fantasy genre. Moving on to the next one, let's talk about high or epic fantasy. Now, I am of the belief that the world's most popular game that I don't like to really mention too much on my channel is really more based off of high or epic fantasy and not so much the grim dark. And I feel that's where you have that disconnect between the OSR and that particular game especially, is that the OSR loves that gritty, grimy, more difficult game that adds that little bit of horror, where the world's most popular and other games like it really go for that almost superhero-like, advanced to be a demigod, epic type of fantasy. And if that's your thing, this is for you. High or epic fantasy is called this because the world that it's in is usually large and fantastic, usually contains magic and magical creatures as commonplace. There's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of large cities, there's a lot of commerce, there's just a lot more of everything. And for some people, that's pretty awesome. They really want to play that game. That's one of the reasons why I feel, especially with this younger generation of new gamers coming in, they really enjoy playing that high fantasy. They want to feel like superheroes. And if that's your thing, go for it. I don't think that you shouldn't. Those games exist for a reason. That's just not the kind of game that I personally play. Adventures in this type of fantasy usually are very large, world-spanning themes of good versus evil, usually with the idea of good defeating evil in the end. You want to check out some books and or other media into this, check out Aragon, the Court of Thorn and Roses series, and the Dragon Riders of Pern series. These are good examples of high fantasy, I feel. Movies like Legend, Clash of the Titans, and the animated movie Fire and Ice also, I feel, capture that high fantasy a little bit more. Tabletops as the already mentioned most popular game, including ones like it, like Pathfinder, Tales of the Valiant, and Castles and Crusades, which is a game I really feel more people should check out. Castles and Crusades, more to come on that later. Moving on to the third subgenre, and the one that Seth Skorkowski clarified for somebody I think really well, that inspired the video, that's sword and sorcery. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that sword and sorcery is kind of a combination of grimdark and high fantasy, sort of. It really depends. I think, personally, sword and sorcery is the most flexible to balance that out differently depending on how you play it. Again, that's just my opinion. You may or may not agree with that. Let me know in the comments below what you think sword and sorcery is. Is it its own thing? Is it a combination of things? I don't know, but I feel in the realm of the OSR community and the gamers that are like the OSR community, sword and sorcery is a very close second to the grim dark style of fantasy, and I think there's a lot of overlap in there, and that's why there's places where they overlap, so it's easy for them to either switch in between with each other, or it's easy for them to be seen in a very similar light. Now, sword and sorcery typically sees magic as ambiguous and dangerous, semi-rarely practiced, but by all kinds of folks. Heroes are typically not necessarily superheroes in this, but they might have magical aid or something that gives them that little bit of edge that normal people don't necessarily have. A little bit more than grimdark will. Where grimdark, that's exceedingly rare. Sword and sorcery, that's almost the point to a degree. It's almost a point for them to have that magical item, that magic person, that whatever MacGuffin it is that they need to get to defeat the guy. Sword and sorcery is usually the place where you see that the most. I might not be 100% on the mark here, but I feel that's where the line is drawn between sword and sorcery and grimdark, is where grimdark, the magic is always considered evil. Sword and sorcery, it's always considered something to be cautious of, but may be practiced by people that don't have necessarily evil intent. That's the biggest thing. Sword and sorcery might also include elements of fantasticness, like a magical creature here or there, a very large magical city of some sort, but that's not going to be the commonplace. That's going to be the rare event. So that's one of the reasons why I feel sword and sorcery is a bit of a combination of high fantasy and grimdark. Once more, this all depends on you as a GM and the world you want to create. Looking to some books and media, the Conan series, of course, is, I think, the quintessential example of sword and sorcery. And if I'm not mistaken, the one that first does that subgenre. I could be wrong on that one. The Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series from Fritz Leibert, a personal favorite of mine, but I think does sword and sorcery excellent. And Throne of the Crescent Moon is a book that also does this really well. Some movies that you can look at for sword and sorcery. There's a ton of these, especially from the 80s, guys. So, I mean, by all means, again, go look up more. I'm just giving you 3 that I liked and I thought did it well. Willow, that was slept on for a while, but I think is now kind of making a comeback in its own way. However, the original Willow is a great movie that does sword and sorcery, I think, almost as perfect as the Conan series does. The Beastmaster and Krull are also cult classics that do sword and sorcery quite well. Games that I think really portray this, they make a Conan tabletop RPG. So once again, I feel that's almost the quintessential there. However, White Box, and I would also argue the Apotheosis game that I did a video on not that long ago, also fits the sword and sorcery genre very, very well. In conclusion, talking about fantasy, there's so many stories that can be told, so much inspiration out there for fantasy. I hope that I've given you some examples that'll help spark your inspiration and your imagination to create wonderful scenarios for your players to get out of, essentially, using some really great, even if not sometimes over the top villains, which personally, when I talk about villains on a video, we might go over this. I love over the top villains, and I think they're the best. But I do hope by breaking down these subgenres of fantasy, I've helped at least a few of you GMs out there really be able to focus in a little bit more on the game you want to play and the world you want to build and the scenarios that you'd like to create for your players. Conversely, on that same coin, I hope that if you're a player and you listen to this, you understand a little bit more about the type of game you'd like to play so you can better convey that to your GM. GMs, be open to understanding the different types of fantasy subgenres so you can dial it into the place where your players want to tell their stories with their characters. Now, I have to fully admit, fantasy is a very broad topic and covers so much more than what I've talked about here today. So tell me in the comments below, what's your favorite type of fantasy? Do you prefer to play games that are based on legends, myths, fairy tales, or folklore from other cultures? If so, which ones and why? But let me stop babbling here. I think I've given you guys enough to think about, digest, and look up for yourselves. All that being said, please take some time to explore fantasy outside of just the typical stuff that we see every day. Find out what you like and what inspires you so you can continue to play for fun first. Remember, Independent RPG Month, everybody, and thanks for watching.